The morning fog rolled in from the ocean like a gray blanket, covering the small town of Clearwater Bay. David sat at his usual corner table in the Harbor View Cafe, sipping his black coffee and reading research papers about ocean life. As a marine biologist, he spent most of his days studying the creatures that live beneath the waves. His life was quiet, predictable, and exactly how he liked it. That Tuesday morning changed everything. She walked into the cafe at exactly 8:47 a.m. David noticed because the old clock on the wall chimed just as the door opened. Every head in the room turned to look at her. She had long dark hair that caught the light perfectly, and she wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than most people in town made in a month. There was something about the way she moved that made everyone stop what they were doing and stare. The cafe owner, Tom, who had been running the place for 20 years and never got nervous around anyone, suddenly started fumbling with the coffee machine. The fishermen at the counter stopped their morning gossip. Even old Mrs. Peterson, who usually complained about everything, went quiet. David tried to focus on his research papers, but he couldn't help glancing up. The woman ordered a cappuccino with extra foam and a blueberry muffin. Her voice had a slight accent that David couldn't quite place, Italian, maybe, or Spanish, when she spoke. She smiled in a way that made everyone in the room feel like they were the only person. She was talking to Dot. She chose a table near the window, pulled out an expensive-looking notebook, and began writing. David noticed she was left-handed, wore no wedding ring, and checked her phone every few minutes. These were the kinds of details his scientific mind always picked up on, even when he wasn't trying to. For the next hour, David watched from the corner of his eyes. Nearly every man in the cafe found an excuse to walk past her table. The mailman took an unusually long time sorting letters near her window. The hardware store owner suddenly needed to use the restroom, which required walking right by her seat. Even Father Rodriguez, the town priest, stopped to introduce himself and welcome her to the community. Each time someone approached, she looked up with genuine interest, asked questions about their work, and remembered their names. She had this amazing ability to make each person feel important, like their job was the most fascinating thing in the world. David was finishing his second cup of coffee when she stood up and walked directly to his table. His heart started beating faster, though he couldn't understand why. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but confident. "I couldn't help but notice you're reading about marine biology. Are you a scientist?" David looked up into her dark brown eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. "Yes, I study ocean life. I work at the research station just outside town." "How wonderful." She clasped her hands together like he'd just told her he discovered buried treasure. "I'm Isabella. By the way, I've always been fascinated by the ocean. The way creatures adapt to survive in such a harsh environment is amazing." "David," he replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from him, "would you like to sit down?" As she settled into the chair, David noticed she smelled like vanilla and something else he couldn't identify, expensive perfume. "Definitely." She leaned forward slightly, showing genuine interest as he started talking about his work. "I'm studying how climate change affects coral reefs," he explained. "The rising ocean temperatures are destroying entire ecosystems." "That must be heartbreaking," she said. And David was surprised to see what looked like real emotion in her eyes. Watching something beautiful disappear and knowing you might be the only one who truly understands what's being lost. David was amazed. Most people glazed over when he talked about his work, but Isabella seemed to hang on every word. She asked intelligent questions about his research methods and nodded thoughtfully at his answers. "I'm actually taking a break from my usual life," she said when he asked what brought her to their small town. "I deal in art, buying and selling pieces for collectors. It's exciting but stressful. I needed somewhere quiet to think and recharge." "Clearwater Bay is certainly quiet," David laughed. "Sometimes too quiet." "What kind of art do you specialize in?" "European paintings, mostly from the 1800s. There's something about the way artists from that era captured emotion that modern art sometimes misses." She stirred her cappuccino slowly. "I'm staying at the Ocean View in for a few weeks. The owner mentioned there's a lighthouse nearby that's supposedly haunted. Have you ever been there? David had lived in the town his entire life and knew every story about the old lighthouse. He found himself offering to show her around, which was completely unlike him. He usually kept to himself, but something about Isabella made him want to share his knowledge of the area. They talked for another hour. Isabella had traveled all over the world, and her stories about art galleries in Paris and ancient ruins in Italy made David feel like his quiet life was small and boring. But she seemed genuinely interested in his work and his town. The ocean calls to certain people, she said, looking out the window at the gray waves. I think you and I are both drawn to things that are deeper than what most people see on the surface. As they prepared to leave, David realized he'd been more engaged in conversation than he had been in months. Isabella had this way of making him feel like the most interesting person in the room, even though she was clearly the one with exciting stories to tell. Would you like to have dinner tomorrow night? She asked, surprising him. I'd love to hear more about your research, and maybe you could recommend some local places to visit. David's usual response would have been to politely decline. He wasn't good at dating, and he preferred his quiet routine. But looking at Isabella's hopeful expression, he heard himself saying yes, perfect. She smiled, and David felt like he'd just won something valuable. I'll pick you up at 7. I have a rental car, so we can drive to that little restaurant on the hill you mentioned. As she left the cafe, David noticed the way every person in the room watched her go. Tom, the owner, stood behind the counter with a strange expression on his face, like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. The fishermen had gone back to their conversation, but David caught them glancing toward the door she'd used. Mrs. Peterson, who had been unusually quiet during Isabella's visit, shuffled over to David's table. That woman, she said in a low voice. She reminds me of someone. Can't quite place who, but there's something familiar about her. David dismissed the comment. Mrs. Peterson was always suspicious of newcomers, especially attractive ones. But as he walked back to his research station, he couldn't shake the feeling that his perfectly ordered life was about to become much more complicated. That evening, David found himself thinking about Isabella instead of his research. He replayed their conversation, amazed at how easily they had connected. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to something other than his work. He had no idea that his name was already written in a notebook, along with detailed observations about his personality, his vulnerabilities, and his potential value as a target. 3 weeks had passed since David first met Isabella, and his life had changed completely. What started as one dinner had turned into almost daily meetings. She would show up at the cafe every morning, always with a new story about her art business or a question about his research. David found himself looking forward to these conversations more than anything else in his day. Isabella had rented a beautiful house on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. She claimed her art dealing was going exceptionally well, and she could afford to extend her stay in Clearwater Bay. The house was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Business has been incredible, she told David during one of their evening walks along the beach. I just sold a painting from the 1800s for more money than I've ever made in a single deal. The buyer was so excited, he paid without even seeing it in person. David was happy for her success, but something felt off. He tried to look up her art business online, but couldn't find any website or social media presence. When he mentioned this, Isabella laughed it off. I prefer to keep things private, she said. My clients value discretion. Many of them are very wealthy and don't want their purchases to be public knowledge. David accepted this explanation, but his scientific mind kept noticing small details that didn't quite fit. Isabella's phone rang constantly, and she always stepped away to take calls. She spoke in different languages, sometimes Italian, sometimes what sounded like Russian. Her explanations about her past kept changing slightly each time she told them. One morning at the cafe, David overheard Tom talking to his wife behind the counter. That woman has been asking a lot of questions about people in town, Tom whispered. Yesterday she wanted to know who owned the biggest houses, who had the most money. Said she was thinking about buying property, but it felt like she was fishing for information. David's stomach tightened. He told himself Tom was just being paranoid. But the comment stuck with him. Later that week, David realized he wasn't the only man in town who had caught Isabella's attention. He first noticed it during the town's monthly council meeting. Isabella had shown up, claiming she wanted to learn more about the community. She sat next to Robert Chen, the wealthy real estate developer who owned half the buildings in town. David watched as Isabella used the same charm on Robert that she'd used on him. She leaned in when he spoke, asked interested questions about his business, and laughed at his jokes. Robert, who was normally serious and focused on business, was practically glowing from the attention. "She's quite something, isn't she?" Robert said to David after the meeting. "Brilliant woman. She's thinking about investing in some of my properties. Could be a very profitable partnership." A few days later, David saw Isabella having coffee with Father Miguel, the young priest who had recently arrived in town. Father Miguel was usually reserved and professional, but with Isabella, he was animated and smiling. David couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see the priest hanging on her every word. Then there was Dr. Harrison, the town's respected doctor who had been practicing for 30 years. David spotted them having lunch at the expensive restaurant on the hill. Dr. Harrison, who was known for being careful with money, was picking up the check and looking happier than David had seen him in years. Each time David saw Isabella with another man, he felt a strange mixture of jealousy and confusion. When he asked her about these meetings, she had perfectly reasonable explanations. "Robert is helping me understand the local real estate market," she said. "Father Miguel is teaching me about the town's history. And Dr. Harrison has been so kind, helping me with some health concerns I've been having." David wanted to believe her, but something felt wrong. He started paying closer attention to Isabella's behavior and noticed patterns that made him uncomfortable. She had an amazing ability to become exactly what each person wanted her to be. With David, she was fascinated by science and ocean life. With Robert, she was a savvy businesswoman interested in investments. With Father Miguel, she was spiritual and thoughtful. With Dr. Harrison, she was vulnerable and in need of care. One evening, David arrived at Isabella's house early for their dinner date. She wasn't expecting him, and he heard her on the phone in the kitchen. She was speaking in what sounded like Russian, her voice completely different from the soft, warm tone she used with him. She sounded cold, calculating, almost like a different person entirely. "The timeline needs to be moved up," she was saying. "The targets are more receptive than expected. We can probably complete the operation within the next month." David's blood ran cold. He quietly backed away from the house and waited in his car until it was time for their official meeting. During dinner, Isabella was her usual charming self, but David couldn't stop thinking about what he'd overheard. "Are you okay?" Isabella asked. Noticing his distraction, "You seem quiet tonight." "Just tired," David lied. "Long day at the lab." Isabella reached across the table and touched his hand. "You work too hard. You need to learn to relax and enjoy life more." Her touch still sent electricity through him, but now it felt dangerous rather than exciting. David realized he was falling for someone he didn't really know at all. That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Isabella's phone call, about the way she seemed to have a different personality for each man she spent time with. He thought about how she'd asked detailed questions about his research facility, about the security systems, about when he worked alone. The next morning, David decided to do some investigating of his own. He used his access to the university's database to search for information about Isabella's art business. What he found made his hands shake. There was no record of any art dealer named Isabella in the databases he searched. More troubling, when he looked up similar cases online, he found news articles about women who had charmed their way into small towns, gained the trust of wealthy men, and then disappeared, leaving financial ruin and sometimes worse in their wake. David's scientific training had taught him to look for patterns and the pattern he was seeing terrified him. Isabella wasn't just a charming woman taking a break from her busy life. She was something much more dangerous. But even knowing this, David realized he was already too deep in her web. To simply walk away, she had made him feel things he'd never experienced before, and part of him desperately wanted to believe that what they had was real. The question was, how many other men in town were thinking the exact same thing? 2 months had passed since Isabella arrived in Clearwater Bay, and David watched in horror as the men around him began to fall apart one by one. What started as his own suspicions about Isabella became a nightmare as he witnessed the destruction she left behind. The first sign of trouble came on a rainy Thursday morning. David was at the cafe when he saw Robert Chen stumbling down the street, his usually perfect appearance disheveled and his eyes red from crying. Robert, who owned half the buildings in town and always carried himself with confidence, looked like a broken man. Tom, the cafe owner, shook his head as he watched Robert through the window. Poor guy lost everything, Tom whispered to his wife. Heard he put all his money into some art investment scheme. Turns out the paintings were fake. His business is ruined. David's heart sank. He remembered Robert mentioning his partnership with Isabella, how excited he'd been about investing in her art deals. Now Robert was walking around town like a ghost, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Within a week, Robert had packed up his things and left town in the middle of the night. Nobody knew where he went. The note he left behind was simple. I can't face what I've done. I'm sorry. David tried to convince himself that Robert's situation wasn't connected to Isabella, but deep down, he knew better. When he asked Isabella about Robert's departure, she seemed genuinely sad. Poor Robert, she said, shaking her head. He made some bad business decisions. I tried to warn him about investing too much money in risky ventures, but he wouldn't listen. Some people get so greedy they can't see clearly. Her explanation sounded reasonable, but David noticed she never mentioned the art deals she'd discussed with Robert. It was like she'd erased that part of their relationship from her memory. The second tragedy happened just 2 weeks later. Father Miguel, the young priest who had been so full of life and energy, suddenly announced he was leaving the church. The announcement came during Sunday service, and everyone in the congregation was shocked. I've made mistakes that go against everything I believe in, Father Miguel said from the pulpit, his voice shaking. I'm not worthy to serve this community anymore. After the service, David overheard the church secretary talking to the board members. The church's building fund, which had taken years to accumulate, was completely empty. $500,000 had vanished, and Father Miguel was taking full responsibility. He said he made bad investments with the church money, the secretary explained, claims he was trying to help the community grow, but everything went wrong. The poor man looks like he hasn't slept in weeks. David knew Father Miguel had been spending a lot of time with Isabella. He remembered seeing them together at the restaurant, deep in conversation about community projects and helping the less fortunate. Isabella had seemed so interested in the church's charitable work. When Father Miguel left town, he looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. David tried to talk to him before he departed, but the priest could barely meet his eyes. Be careful who you trust, Father Miguel whispered to David. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life are the most dangerous. Isabella's reaction to Father Miguel's departure was even more concerning than her response to Robert's situation. She seemed almost irritated by the whole thing. Religious people can be so dramatic. She said dismissively, he probably just realized he wasn't cut out for the priesthood and made up some story about money to make his exit more interesting. David was beginning to see a pattern, but the worst was yet to come. Dr. Harrison had been the town's most respected doctor for 30 years. He was known for his careful nature and his dedication to his patients. He'd never married, claiming his work was his life, and he lived modestly despite his successful practice. Everything changed after he started spending time with Isabella. Dr. Harrison began talking about retirement, about finally living life for himself instead of always caring for others. He updated his will, started taking expensive trips, and seemed happier than anyone had seen him in years. That woman has been good for him. People said He's finally learning to enjoy life. But David noticed other changes too. Dr. Harrison looked tired all the time, complained of headaches, and seemed to have trouble concentrating. When David asked about his health, the doctor brushed off his concerns, just getting older. Dr. Harrison said with a weak smile, Isabella keeps telling me I need to slow down and take better care of myself. 3 weeks later, Dr. Harrison died in his sleep. The official cause was heart failure, which wasn't unusual for a man his age. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At the funeral, David learned that Dr. Harrison had recently changed his will, leaving his entire estate to Isabella. The doctor's nephew, who had expected to inherit at least part of his uncle's wealth, was devastated. Uncle Harrison was always so careful about money, the nephew told David. He never made impulsive decisions. Then suddenly he meets this woman and changes everything. It doesn't make sense. Isabella attended the funeral, dressed in elegant black and crying appropriately. She played the role of the grieving friend perfectly, accepting condolences and sharing stories about how kind Dr. Harrison had been to her. But David noticed something that made his blood run cold. During the service, while everyone else was focused on the ceremony, Isabella checked her phone. For just a moment, her sad expression disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like satisfaction. That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the 3 men who had been destroyed since Isabella arrived in town. Robert, ruined financially and driven from town. Father Miguel, disgraced and forced to abandon his calling. Dr. Harrison, dead under suspicious circumstances. David realized he was seeing the work of someone who was much more dangerous than a simple con artist. Isabella wasn't just stealing money or breaking hearts. She was systematically destroying lives, and she was very good at it. The most terrifying part was that David understood he was probably next. Isabella had been asking more and more questions about his research facility, about the security systems, about his work schedule. She'd been particularly interested in a rare coral specimen he mentioned, something that would be worth a fortune to the right buyer. But David had one advantage that the others hadn't possessed. His scientific training had taught him to observe patterns, to question assumptions, and to look for evidence before drawing conclusions. While the other men had been completely blinded by Isabella's charm, David had been taking notes. He had documentation of her lies, recordings of her suspicious phone calls, and research about similar cases in other towns. Most importantly, he had figured out her pattern before she could complete her plan. The question was, would it be enough to save his life? 3 months had passed since Isabella arrived in Clearwater Bay, and David knew he was living on borrowed time. The deaths and disappearances of the other men had shown him exactly what Isabella was capable of. But he also knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. She would just find him wherever he went, or worse, she would move on to destroy another innocent town. David made the hardest decision of his life. He would stay and fight, but he would have to be smarter than she was. The only way to survive was to make Isabella believe she was still in control while secretly gathering evidence that could stop her forever. Playing along with Isabella's game was like walking on thin ice. Every conversation, every smile, every moment of affection had to seem genuine while David's mind raced with fear and planning. He forced himself to act like the same trusting man she'd first met at the cafe, even though everything inside him screamed danger. You seem different lately, Isabella said one evening as they walked along the beach. More distant? Are you okay? David's heart pounded, but he managed to smile. Just stressed about work. The research facility has been having some security issues, and I'm worried about the valuable specimens we keep there. Isabella's eyes lit up with interest. Exactly as David had expected. Security issues. That sounds serious. What kind of specimens are you worried about? There's a rare coral sample that's worth more money than I make in 10 years, David said, feeding her the information he knew she wanted. It's the only one of its kind in captivity. If someone stole it, they could sell it to private collectors for millions. That's terrible, Isabella said, but David caught the brief flash of excitement in her eyes. Surely the facility has good security systems. That's the problem. David continued his performance. The system is old and has vulnerabilities. I've been working late nights trying to upgrade it, but I'm not really a tech expert. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just making it worse. Over the next few days, Isabella began asking more detailed questions about the research facility. She wanted to know about the security cameras, the alarm systems, David's work schedule, and especially when he worked alone. David answered all her questions, but he was careful to give her false information mixed with just enough truth to seem believable. While Isabella thought she was gathering intelligence, David was actually setting a trap. He had contacted Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI, who had been investigating a series of cases involving a woman matching Isabella's description. The agent had been tracking this criminal across multiple states, always arriving just after she had disappeared. She's extremely dangerous. Agent Walsh had told David during their secret phone call, "We believe she's responsible for at least 12 deaths and millions of dollars in theft. Her real name is Katerina Volkov, and she's part of an international criminal organization." David had been recording Isabella's phone calls using equipment he'd borrowed from the research facility. Her conversations in Russian had been translated, revealing discussions about eliminating the final target and acquiring the valuable specimen. The recordings would be crucial evidence, but they also confirmed David's worst fears about what Isabella planned to do to him. The most chilling discovery came when David found Isabella's real notebook. She had been careless one evening, leaving her bag open while she used the bathroom. Inside was a detailed journal with information about every man she had targeted. Robert's financial records, Father Miguel's weaknesses, Dr. Harrison's medical history, and David's own profile were all documented with clinical precision. Next to David's name, she had written, "Final target, eliminate after acquiring coral. Specimen, stages laboratory accident." David's hands shook as he read those words. Isabella wasn't just planning to rob him, she was planning to end his life and make it look like an accident. The coral specimen was valuable, but David realized he had been the real prize all along. His access to the research facility, his knowledge of the security systems, and his trusting nature had made him the perfect target. But David also found something else in the notebook that gave him hope. Isabella had a weakness. She was overconfident. Her previous successes had made her sloppy, and she had started to believe she was untouchable. The notebook contained details about her other crimes, locations of hidden money, and contact information for her criminal associates. The final piece of David's plan fell into place when Isabella suggested a romantic dinner at the research facility. She claimed she wanted to see where he worked, to better understand the passion that drove him. David knew this was her move to steal the coral and eliminate him, but he agreed enthusiastically. "That sounds wonderful," he said, forcing excitement into his voice. "I can show you the lab where I keep the coral. It's beautiful at night when the facility is empty. We'll have complete privacy." Isabella's smile was perfect, but David caught the predatory gleam in her eyes. "Privacy sounds perfect. I'll bring dinner, and you can give me a complete tour of the facility." As they made plans for what Isabella thought would be David's last night alive, David was making his own preparations. Agent Walsh and her team would be in position around the facility. The security cameras that Isabella thought were old and broken had actually been upgraded with FBI equipment. Every moment of her planned crime would be recorded. Most importantly, David had prepared a surprise that Isabella would never expect. He had learned from studying her previous victims that she had a specific method for eliminating her targets. She used a rare poison that mimicked natural heart failure, the same substance that had likely ended Dr. Harrison's life. David had spent weeks researching antidotes and had prepared a counteragent using compounds from his marine biology lab. If Isabella tried to poison him, he would be ready. The night before their final meeting, David barely slept. He kept thinking about Robert, Father Miguel, and Dr. Harrison. They had all trusted Isabella completely, never seeing the danger until it was too late. David was determined that their deaths would not be in vain. Tomorrow night, Either Isabella would complete her plan and add another victim to her list, or David would finally put an end to her reign of terror. The hunter was about to become the hunted, but Isabella had no idea that her intended victim had been preparing for this moment for weeks. As David lay in bed, listening to the ocean waves outside his window, he realized that his quiet life as a marine biologist had prepared him for this moment better than he could have imagined. He had spent years studying predators, understanding their hunting patterns, and learning how creatures survived in dangerous environments. Tomorrow, he would find out if those skills were enough to survive the most dangerous predator he had ever encountered. The night had finally arrived. David stood in his research facility, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of orange and red. In 30 minutes, Isabella would arrive for what she believed would be the perfect ending to her plan. David had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, his hands were shaking. Agent Walsh's voice crackled through the tiny earpiece hidden in David's ear. "We're in position around the building. Remember, stick to the plan. Let her make the first move, and we'll have everything we need to arrest her." David touched the small device sewn into his shirt collar. It would record every word of their conversation. In his pocket, he carried the antidote he had prepared, hoping he wouldn't need it, but ready if Isabella tried to poison him. At exactly 7 o'clock, Isabella knocked on the facility's main door. David opened it to find her standing there with a basket of food and a bottle of wine, looking absolutely beautiful in a flowing blue dress. If David hadn't known what she really was, he would have thought she was the perfect woman. "This place is amazing," Isabella said as David gave her a tour of the labs. "I can see why you love working here. It's like having your own private piece of the ocean." David led her through the facility, pointing out different research projects and explaining his work. Isabella listened with apparent fascination, but David noticed her eyes constantly scanning the room, memorizing the layout and security features. "And this is where I keep the coral specimen I told you about," David said, opening the door to his private lab. The rare coral glowed softly under the special lighting, its colors shifting like a living rainbow. "It's breathtaking," Isabella whispered, moving closer to examine the specimen. "No wonder it's worth so much money. Something this beautiful and rare belongs in a private collection, where it can be properly appreciated." David felt a chill at her words. She was already thinking about stealing it, probably planning to sell it to the highest bidder. "I've dedicated my life to studying creatures like this. They're not just valuable objects. They're living pieces of our planet's history." Isabella turned to face him, and for a moment, David saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. Then, her expression softened, and she was back to being the charming woman he thought he had fallen in love with. "Of course," she said, touching his arm gently. "That's what makes you so special, David. You see the real value in things, not just their price tag." They set up their dinner in the lab, with the coral specimen glowing softly nearby. Isabella had brought all of David's favorite foods and a bottle of expensive wine. She poured 2 glasses and handed one to David. "Two unexpected discoveries," she said, raising her glass in a toast. David clinked his glass against hers, but only pretended to drink. He had learned from his research that Isabella's preferred method was to poison her victims. Drinks, the wine, probably contained enough poison to stop his heart within minutes. As they ate, Isabella steered the conversation toward David's security access and the facility's alarm systems. She was gathering final details for her plan, still believing David was completely under her control. "I've been thinking about what you said about the security problems," she said casually. "Maybe I could help you upgrade the systems. I have connections with some tech companies that specialize in high security installations." "That's very thoughtful," David replied, "but I wouldn't want to put you in danger. Some of the chemicals we store here can be quite hazardous if handled incorrectly." Isabella's laugh was light and musical. "Don't worry about me. I'm tougher than I look." As the evening progressed, David noticed Isabella becoming impatient. She kept checking her phone and glancing at the coral specimen. Finally, she excused herself to use the restroom, and David knew this was when she would make her move. The moment Isabella left the room, David dumped his wine into a nearby plant and replaced it with water. He also activated the facility's lockdown protocol, sealing all the exits. Agent Walsh and her team would be moving into position now, when Isabella returned. She was carrying a small device that David recognized as a professional safe-cracking tool. She had dropped her act entirely, and her whole demeanor had changed. The sweet, vulnerable woman was gone, replaced by someone cold and dangerous. "You know," Isabella said, her voice now carrying a slight accent. "I think I've learned enough about your security systems." David's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. "What do you mean?" Isabella smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile David had fallen for. This smile was predatory, like a shark that had smelled blood in the water. "I mean, it's time to stop pretending. You're not as smart as you think you are, David. Did you really believe I didn't know you were suspicious of me?" David felt his world shift. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do," Isabella said, moving closer to the coral specimen. "You've been watching me, asking questions, trying to figure out what happened to Robert and the others. You even contacted the FBI, didn't you?" David's blood ran cold. How could she know about Agent Walsh? Isabella saw his expression and laughed. "You scientists are so predictable. You think you can solve everything by gathering data and looking for patterns. But you miss the most important pattern of all." "What pattern?" David asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. "The pattern that shows you were never the hunter in this game." Isabella said, "You were always the prey. I've been 3 steps ahead of you from the moment we met. I knew you would get suspicious. I knew you would try to investigate me. I even knew you would contact the FBI." Isabella pulled out her phone and showed David a photo. It was Agent Walsh, but she was tied up and looked terrified. "Your FBI friend is indisposed at the moment. The team you thought was surrounding this building. They're my associates." David felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Everything he had planned, all his careful preparations, had been anticipated by Isabella. She had been playing a game that was far more complex than he had imagined. "Why?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because you have something I need," Isabella said, gesturing to the coral specimen. "And because loose ends are bad for business. Robert, Father Miguel, Dr. Harrison, they all served their purpose. Now it's your turn." But as Isabella reached for the coral specimen, David smiled. "You're right about one thing," he said. "I am predictable. But you made one mistake." "What mistake?" Isabella asked, pausing with her hand inches from the coral. "You assumed I was working alone," David said. "But marine biologists understand something that criminals don't. We know that the best way to survive in dangerous waters is to work in groups." The lights in the facility suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in red. Isabella spun around, confused and angry. "You see," David continued, "I never contacted Agent Walsh. I contacted the Coast Guard, the Marine Patrol, and my colleagues at universities across the country. While you were busy tracking one FBI agent, an entire network of people was tracking you." The sound of helicopters filled the air, and bright searchlights began scanning the building. Isabella's face went pale as she realized her mistake. "It's over," David said quietly. "You can't charm your way out of this one." Isabella looked at David with something that might have been respect. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for." "I learned from the best teacher," David replied. "You showed me that survival isn't about being the strongest or the most beautiful. It's about being the most adaptable." As the authorities closed in, David realized that his quiet life as a Marine biologist had finally prepared him for something truly important. He had survived the most dangerous predator he had ever encountered, not through violence or deception, but through patience, observation, and the wisdom to know when to ask for help. Isabella was led away in handcuffs, her reign of terror finally over. David stood in his lab, looking at the coral specimen that had been part of her plan. It continued to glow softly, a beautiful reminder that even in the darkest depths, life finds a way to survive and thrive. For the first time in months, David felt truly safe. But more than that, he felt proud. He had not only survived Isabella's seduction, but had also ensured that no one else would fall victim to her deadly charm.